Welcome to the first talk in the 2020-21 Geology lecture series here at SWOCC. We've all been through some challenging times in the last 7 months, and while we continue virtually for the foreseeable future, I'm pleased to host the Geology lecture series at a distance because now more than ever we need to maintain our sense of society and also to keep cutting-edge science on the spotlight. When I first started working with IRIS, the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, to host Dr. Stein for this particular talk, it was to conclude a week of celebration highlighting the opening of the new Health and Science building here at SWOCC. For obvious reasons, this has been postponed. One of the things that I miss presently is the opportunity to showcase both our campus and also the geology of our region to our speakers, and also the casual conversations that I'm fortunate to be able to have in my kitchen and other places outside the lecture hall. I'm grateful for the travel that past speakers have been willing to undertake to get to Coos Bay, as we know that we're not always the easiest destination to reach. And now I appreciate also the willingness of these speakers to go virtual so that we can continue the long tradition of bringing science talks to our community. For those of you that normally contribute to the tip jar, you still can contribute to the College Foundation. You can go online, just indicate that your donation is for the lecture series or even for student scholarships. In the past, your support has been very beneficial to making sure that we can continue to bring the highest quality speakers to campus, raising over $1,000 a year just from those donations alone. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ross S. Stein, who will be speaking on how the gold rush and the 1906 earthquake, San Francisco earthquake, enabled us to divine our seismic future. Dr. Stein is an emeritus scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's an adjunct professor at Stanford and also is the CEO and co-founder of Temblor Incorporated. He's been recognized by numerous organizations in the geosciences with a variety of achievement awards, too numerous to list here. He's given many distinguished lectureships and much, much more. He's also recognized for the insight he provides in public media interviews and also in his public talks, which has always been an important component of trying to find scientists that are at the top of their game, but also can explain complicated concepts to general audiences as well. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Ross S. Stein.
Thank you. This is a San Francisco story about what was discovered there, what was suffered there, and how they combined to change our understanding of the world. Now, as a resident of the Bay Area, I can tell you that everything we love about the San Francisco Bay Area has been brought to us by the faults. Napa Valley, Silicon Valley, and Carmel Valley, Tomales Bay, San Francisco Bay, and Monterey Bay, even Lake Tahoe. Absent the San Andreas and Hayward faults, there would be no San Francisco Bay, the only deep water port along the California coastline, and so the wellspring of the gold rush. The Hayward Fault lifts up the Oakland and Berkeley hills with their magnificent sunset views of the Golden Gate. The San Gregorio Fault makes Big Sur big. A bend in the San Andreas thrust up the Santa Cruz Mountains, the spine of the peninsula, and the Marin Headlands. These coastal ranges temper our climate, bathe us in fog, and crown us in redwoods. What I want you to see is that we enjoy the fruits of the faults every day. So we have to live with their occasional spoils, as befell the Bay Area in 1868, most famously in 1906, and most recently in 1989. You'll learn tonight, although we cannot predict earthquakes, we know why and where the hazard is high, and we can erect structures that can withstand anything the faults can hurl at them. And I will leave you with the means to assess your own seismic risk, to assure the safety of your own family. Now, this is the world bequeathed to us in the plate tectonic revolution of the mid-1960s. It was the realization that the surface of the Earth is not fixed and rigid, but highly mobile, moving at fractions of an inch to several inches a year. Where the plates pull apart from each other and are born are these globe-encircling mid-ocean ridges in lime yellow, and where they collide with each other are the subduction zones in magenta. And there, the denser of the two opposing plates gets shoved under the lighter one. And these are the hatcheries of the world's greatest earthquakes. Now, the evidence that the surface of the Earth had to be mobile was thrown down by the 1906 earthquake. But that evidence never would have arrived had it not been for the gold rush 50 years beforehand. And it's the serendipitous combustion of those elements that forms the story I want to tell you tonight.
Well, here's where it all began, with a one-paragraph entry in the Daily Californian, gold mine found. And it looked like they were foretelling not the gold rush, but the tech boom in that line below. And as soon as the Federal Army came to Sutter's Mill to assay the gold and announced that this was the real thing, it launched the largest armada of ships the world had ever known, with 60,000 people abandoning their homes, families, and jobs, boarding ships, many of whom sailed halfway around the world to reach the gold fields. And this is how it was supposed to work. There'd be miners out in the Golden Gate waving the ships in with hankies. But it didn't actually work out that way, because the Golden Gate has some of the most treacherous water along the California coastline. Dense fog, high winds, deep chop, and many of these ships, after sailing these enormous globe-girdling trips, came to grief off the Golden Gate. And so the federal government brought the Coast and Geodetic Survey to California. And the reason why the maps were so poor is this. This looks nothing like the California coastline. And the ship captains were supposed to just line the ship up so that they could see Alcatraz in the middle of the Golden Gate and shoot their way in. So it didn't work out that way. And so the Coast and Geodetic Survey arrived. Now, the ability to measure long distances accurately had to await the invention of the laser in 1970. Until that time, it was impossible to measure long distances. And so how maps were made was using an instrument called a theodolite and measuring angle differences to other stations. So you'd get up on a promontory and you'd measure angles to a bunch of other promontories. And then you'd repeat that on the other promontories until you develop this spider's web of points. And because the angles to all of those distant points had to match, it would allow you to place each point in its exact location. So that's how the maps were made. They first came out in 1850, and about every decade thereafter, as instruments became more accurate and lighter, they would come out and resurvey all these points. Now, there's a peculiarity about making a map by turning angles. And it's this. Let's say this is a balloon, and I paint a square on the balloon, and then I inflate the balloon some more. Have any of those angles changed? No. So if you're making a map by measuring angles, you're completely insensitive to expansion of the ground or contraction of the ground. Now, nobody thought that the ground did anything but sit there, so it wasn't a problem as far as the surveyors were concerned. But look at this. What if this square is sheared? Then two of the angles get smaller and two of the angles get larger. So just as an accident of measuring, making good maps by measuring angles, you were sensitive to whether or not the land was shearing. And that's the only thing you were sensitive to, even though nobody thought it was shearing or would be. So here is the first map that was completed in 1856. You can see that it's absolutely beautiful. It's as accurate as any you will see today. And I love the fact that a geodetic survey map includes sailing directions. Now, there is San Francisco, shortly after the gold rush. So let's take a look. So here is the city in 1853. It had gone from 15,000 people to 150,000 in a year. And by the time this map is made, the entire city had already burned to the ground twice. The principal gold rush cove was Yerba Buena, but some ships anchored in Mission Bay at the bottom or the Marina to the north. Now let's take a look at a contemporary painting from one of the ships into Yerba Buena Cove. San Francisco, almost treeless, almost unrecognizable, with about a half a dozen ships at anchor. Now let's look at this again, just a few years later after the gold rush. And look at this. There are 90 ships in this picture. And look at San Francisco itself. It's gone from 20 or so buildings to tens of thousands. Now I want to show you San Francisco just 2 years later, also Yerba Buena Cove. It's almost uncountable, but photographs like this have been counted, and there are 700 ships in this picture. Now look again. These ships are rotting in place. What happened was the moment these ships dropped anchor, the paying passengers raced off the boats, boarding steamships to take them up the Sacramento River to Sacramento, where they would then get into the gold fields in the Sierra foothills. And so would the sailing crew, because the wages of miners were 10 times higher than the wages of sailors. And so the most lucrative marine merchant route in the world ended up all being one-way passages. And the boats simply rotted in place. And so San Franciscans said, well, we need a deeper port anyway. They dumped sand on top of the ships and created a new San Francisco. And if you don't believe me that today's financial district, which was formerly Yerba Buena Cove, is built on the rotting hulks of gold rush ships, here is one that was excavated 20 years ago, right next to the Transamerica Tower. Now let's go back to that map of San Francisco and compare the coastline to what it is today. So you can see that all of that is fill. All of that is basically junk land that covers up the rotting hulk of these ships. And it's really remarkable to think that the source of the financial boom, the financial district, is Yerba Buena Cove. The site of the tech boom is Mission Bay and its marsh. And the site of the singles pickup boom is the marina up there to the left. And as a result of this soft land, in 1906, this is where the greatest destruction was, in these fill areas, and also in 1989 during the Loma Prieta earthquake. Now, everything changed for San Francisco on April 18th, 1906. And perhaps the most beautiful contemporary account of the earthquake was written by Jack London, who lived in Oakland, and was published on May 5th. So I want to just read you some passages of Jack London as we look at contemporary photos. San Francisco is gone. Nothing remains of it but memories and a fringe of dwelling houses on its outskirts. Its industrial section is wiped out. Its business section is wiped out. Its social and residential section is wiped out. The factories and warehouses, the great stores and newspaper buildings, the hotels and the palaces of the nabobs are all gone. Remains only the fringe of dwelling houses on the outskirts of what was once San Francisco. On Wednesday morning at 5:15 came the earthquake. A minute later, the flames were leaping upward. In a dozen different quarters south of Market Street, in the working class ghetto, and in the factories, fires started. There was no opposing the flames. There was no organization, no communication. All the cunning adjustments of a 20th century city have been smashed by the earthquake. An enumeration of the buildings destroyed would be a directory of San Francisco. An enumeration of the buildings undestroyed would be a line and several addresses. An enumeration of the deeds of heroism would stock a library and bankrupt the Carnegie Medal Fund. An enumeration of the dead will never be made. All vestiges of them were destroyed by the flames. I went inside with the owner of a house on the steps of which I sat. He was cool and cheerful and hospitable. Yesterday morning, he said I was worth $600,000. This morning, this house is all I have left. It will go in 15 minutes. He pointed to a large cabinet that is my wife's collection of china. The rug upon which we stand is a present. It cost $1,500. Try that piano. Listen to its tone. There are few like it. The flames will be here in 15 minutes. There are no horses. And he was right. Nearly everything that hadn't already been destroyed by the shaking was incinerated by the fires. But after the earthquake, geologists from Berkeley and Stanford and Johns Hopkins University from back east started to walk north and south along the lines of the destruction. And what they found surprised them. They saw a tear or rent in the landscape here at the base of Tamales Bay. And this woman, by the way, is Alice Eastwood, who single-handedly saved the botany collection of the California Academy of Sciences. The photograph was taken by G.K. Gilbert, one of our greatest geologists of the era. And they found something else, that whenever the fault crossed a fence line or a road or a row of trees, it was offset, and offset in a peculiar way. These two yellow dots in each picture used to be side by side. So whichever side you're on, the other side has been shunted to the right. And they called that right lateral slip. And they found that along the entire 250-mile long fault. Anything between 4 feet and 20 feet of displacement in a right lateral sense. And then Harry Reid from Johns Hopkins says, hey, let's bring the Coast and Geodetic Survey back to resurvey, because they will be able to measure these same displacements, and we'll be able to figure out as we move away from the fault, the displacements, do they remain? Do they get larger, or do they get smaller? And so the Coast and Geodetic Survey came out and resurveyed all these points. And now I'm going to draw a dotted line perpendicular to San Andreas and put all the vectors from the Farallon Islands to the west and Point Reyes all the way to Mount Diablo in the east in their positions. And what you can see is that, yes, there is about 12 feet of right lateral slip on the fault, but as you move away from the fault, the displacements get very, very small. So it's like along the fault, the land leaped ahead, but it seemed to be pinned at farther distances away. And then Reid said, well, look, let's take a look at all those 50 years of measurements between the time of the gold rush and the time of the 1906 earthquake to see if anything was moving then. And when he did that, he found these motions during that 50-year period. And if we slide them back on their distance from the San Andreas on a perpendicular, you see something truly remarkable. The whole area was caught in a giant shear vise. Everything was moving. The earthquake isn't the whole show. The land had been moving all along. And then Reid made another great leap. He said, okay, let's say it had been moving not just for 50 years, but 250 years. Then, in a 200-plus year period, the Farallon Islands would have moved about 15 feet to the north with respect to Mount Diablo. Now let's add on those motions that occurred during the earthquake. Those are the yellow vectors. And if we add them together, we get something very simple. In other words, over time, the two sides of the fault are slowly going past each other, but they get hung up, they get stuck along the fault due to friction. And eventually, they overcome that friction and catch up. So the fault isn't actually moving ahead, it's catching up. Now, the other amazing thing about this is that Reed could deduce something like an inch a year of the long-term displacement of the fault. Well, that was completely incongruous with everybody's understanding of how the Earth works, because the Earth was viewed to be fixed and rigid. And even at that time, when the Earth was believed to be around 10 million years old, not the 3.5 billion we know today, that would mean several hundred miles of cumulative slip on the fault. And that was inconceivable with a fixed and rigid Earth. So what Reed did, like a good scientist, is simply to plant the seed of this observation that he couldn't explain, and that seed would take 50 years to germinate, and ultimately it would bloom as the plate tectonic revolution in the 1960s. Now, there's a further powerful insight that Reed gave us, which is that since the whole region is caught in the vise, the San Andreas isn't the only player. The Hayward Fault had a great earthquake in 1868. There are other faults, the San Gregorio, the Grenville, and the San Andreas was the most recent. So all of these are active. And all of these, since they're shearing, give themselves away because of that shear. So Reed's argument was, if you want to know where future earthquakes are going to happen, you don't have to wait around until they occur. Measure the shear. If you see the ground shearing, ultimately, it's going to have to release all those stresses in an earthquake. And today, with 30,000 GPS receivers around the globe, continuously recording minute millimeter per year displacements, we can do just that. So Japan is in the center top of this image, the Philippines center bottom, and as we places of enormous strains and great earthquakes. Here you can see that India has been in its 40 million year long collision with Asia, thrusting up the roof of the Earth in Tibet, and you can see individual faults in China. Turning it some more, we see the North Anatolian Fault running east-west in Turkey, very much a San Andreas-like feature. Some of the large faulting activities in Italy, and finally the North American Cordillera with the San Andreas system skirting the coastline of the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is his legacy, the ability to make these measurements and understand what they mean. Now, what I'd like to do now is to take a few minutes and give you a deeper insight into the earthquake machine and how it works and what its constituents are. I call it Quakecaster, and it'll be a lot of fun.
So let me introduce you to the earthquake machine. So this machine has everything you need to create earthquakes, but nothing extraneous. And there are only 4 elements. The first is the steady motion of the plate's interiors, which are driving the slip along the faults. And that's represented by this casting reel. And I'm just pulling in this line. And that line is attached to a rubber band. And that rubber band represents the rubberiness, the elasticity of the Earth's crust. Believe it or not, it's elastic, but just very stiff elastic material. And finally, it's connected to these kitchen countertop samples, this mass, which is going to move in an earthquake, and it's sitting on a industrial strength frictional surface. And I've sandblasted the bottom of these bricks, so there's rough friction there. All right, so now what I'm going to do is crank as steadily as I can, and I just want you to watch what happens. Okay, so you saw that the bricks sat there for several hundred years, and then bang, they'd move during an earthquake, and then they'd sit again. There's nothing I can do in this experiment to keep those bricks moving constantly. They always produce earthquakes as long as these elements are here. So now let me ask you a question. Were all the earthquakes separated by the same amount of time? No. Were they all the same size if we measure size by how much they slipped? No. This is very bad news. If I can't make regular repeating earthquakes with Home Depot sandpaper, rubber band, and bricks, we're never going to get them in the earth. Because the earth has much more variability than you see here. The rubberiness comes from material properties. Granite, basalt, sediments, they're different. Faults are grungy and have bends and breaks. Some are smooth, some are rough. So they'll be different too. And the amount of mass involved changes from place to place. So that means that we can never talk about earthquakes as being 10 months pregnant. They're not regular. They're not periodic. And that is the bitter pill that seismologists have had to swallow in the last 50 years of research on earthquake prediction. Okay, let me ask you another question. What if I repeat the experiment? Now, I take one brick off. So now I've got only half the mass over here, but same elasticity, same friction, and I crank at the same speed. Am I going to get smaller earthquakes or larger? Frequent, more frequent, or less? And I think you can see here, you still get earthquakes, but they are smaller, maybe half the size, and they are about twice as frequent. And that makes sense because the resistance is only half what it was before. So the spring gets to the tension where it can overcome resistance and we get an earthquake, but it hasn't stretched as much, so we don't get as large a slip as before. And we have places on the San Andreas that can produce two brickers, like where the 1906 earthquake occurred in Northern California or the 1857 earthquake in Southern, both about 7.7, 7.8 events. And we have places on the San Andreas that are one brickers, Parkfield, which produces a magnitude 6 to 6.5 earthquake every 20 to 40 or so years. Again, variable in terms of its occurrence, but all smaller. Now let me take one step further. You can see that this surface is shiny because it's been polished. This surface, we sandblasted to make it rough. So what if I just turn this over? So now I have the same friction down below. I've got the same stiffness in the spring. I'm going to crank at the same rate, and we have a one bricker as before. Now what are we going to get? Are we going to get earthquakes? Are they smaller or larger? Or are we just going to get it to creep along without earthquakes? And I think what you can see here is that it's not purely creeping. It has little staccato earthquakes that are accompanied, but it's largely creep. Little earthquakes you see now and then. And we have that section on the San Andreas too. It's called the creeping section. It's 100 miles long and extends from south of the Bay Area to Parkfield, and it produces more earthquakes than anywhere else on the fault. But they're all small and they're accompanied by creep. And just like this experiment, one side of the fault has high friction, it's granite. The other side of the fault, low friction, it's clay. So this is also seen. Now you might say, okay, that's great if earthquakes are in isolation, but earthquakes aren't normally in isolation. And we have a long fault. San Andreas is almost 1,000 miles long, and even the biggest earthquakes we've seen are only a couple hundred miles. So what about earthquakes communicating with each other down the fault? What happens when one earthquake occurs? Does that load things up for the next one? So now I'm going to show you that by creating 3 of them in series, and they're connected by rubber bands, just like the first one is. Okay? So now the question for you is, which is going to go first, which second, and which third? You ready? It gets really interesting really fast, right? This guy went actually first, second, and third until he had loaded up this guy. Then this guy went, then this guy went. But some of the times, they all went together. And that further greatly complicates the problem of earthquake prediction because no little earthquake knows it's marked for future greatness. Whether or not it takes its siblings along for the ride or not isn't clear. But under some circumstances, we can have a cascade that ultimately produces a very large earthquake, but more often than not, we get individual small events. And in 1992 in Southern California, in the Mojave Desert, we had an earthquake, Landers. and occurring on 3 closely connected faults that on a good day could have produced a 6.5, but they all got together in 30 seconds and produced a 7.3. So this happens, and when it happens, it produces much larger earthquakes. Now, the final thing I want to show you is perhaps the most important in terms of what we can say. We can't predict an earthquake. After a big earthquake has occurred, can we say where the hazard is now higher, where earthquakes are now more likely, and where less? So now I'm going to go back to the 2-bricker spot. I'm going to get it just about ready to go, and I'm going to ask you the question, what happens if I lift the top brick? It goes, right? Because I've unclamped the fault, the faces that keep it in contact. My fault is like this, the San Andreas is like this. So if by a nearby earthquake I can transfer stress that tends to unclamp the fault, not even lifting a brick, just shaving a brick, and the fault is close to failure, I can trigger an earthquake. And by the same token, if I'm just about ready to go and I pull on the spring a little bit more, adding shear stress on the fault, I can trigger an earthquake. But this only works if I'm close to failure. If I'm not close to failure, lifting a brick does nothing, pulling does nothing. And this tells us, since when we calculate this after big earthquakes, we have stress trigger zones and we have stress shadows where the stress has dropped because we've added a brick or loosened on the rubber band. Because we generally see aftershocks in the stress trigger zones, it tells us that most faults spend most of their lives close to failure. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And because it works, what we can do is calculate how one earthquake changes the stress around it, and therefore where the next earthquakes and aftershocks are likely to be. Okay, now let's put this in action in the Bay Area.
So with QuakeCaster in mind, let's go back to the Bay Area and look at the 75 years of earthquakes before the 1906 event took place, because that's how far our history, our frail history, goes back. And the amazing thing you see here is that 6s and 7s are just ricocheting all over the bay, including an 1838 earthquake on the San Andreas and an 1868 earthquake on the Hayward Fault. Now I want you to compare that to the 75 years after 1906, during which, if anything, we had better recording of earthquakes that would occur. Almost nothing. The rate of earthquakes dropped by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10. And so, with the insights of QuakeCaster and the idea of Coulomb stress transfer, what you can see is that most of the fault fell under the stress shadow of that great earthquake. In other words, we relaxed the spring or threw on another brick. And the regions that got closer to failure, where failure was promoted, where we pulled on the spring or lifted a brick, are off to the south, at the lower right end, and way off to the north at Cape Mendocino. So all of these faults were put into a profound period of seismic sleep. But the gods keep cranking on the QuakeCaster, and so the rubber bands will continue to be tensioning for the last 115 years. And so here we are with a visualization of how the stresses are probably building today, where the San Andreas' zone of low stress is getting narrower and narrower, and high stress is coming in on faults in the East Bay and faults out offshore. So, as we're heading into a period that almost certainly will have a higher rate of earthquakes as the stress increases. And so for those people like me who live in the Bay Area, this is the time for a little bit of gallows humor. So what we really should be doing is saying, okay, if this is in our future, how do we prepare for it? How do we live in buildings that can survive earthquakes? And that's what I'm going to show you in the next demo called Model Quake Towers.
You're looking at a building that you can find anywhere in the world. It's made out of stacks of cubes. And even though this building is bolted to the ground, in my case with Velcro, which is great, its problem is that no matter how strong you build the columns and the beams, It's only as strong as its weakest corner. And what an earthquake does principally is shake the ground from side to side. And you can see, because the corners are weak, this building is extremely weak. And earthquakes also produce torsion. And again, you can see how weak this building is. If any one of these corners breaks, this building is probably coming down. And that's because a cube lacks structural integrity. And by that I mean, look at this. IKEA house. Stick it in your station wagon, drive it home. Now let's put this bad guy aside. This is the exact same building as this one, made the exact same materials, except I've snapped in little corner braces, just with sewing snaps. See, I've just taken this guy out and I can snap him back in. Now look. Nothing. This building is a collapse risk. This building is going to do well. What's the difference in cost when you build a building to build this one rather than this one? Think about your guess. It's 1 to 2%. And even if this is an older building that needs to be retrofitted to come up to this standard, it's only about 2 to 3%. For a typical home, the cost of a half bath. But nobody is going to go from this building to this building unless they're convinced they're at risk and they see how much this would make their lives safer. So let's take a look at what are the features in buildings that make them safe.
And so now I think you can understand why this is the epitome of seismic design. It has a tall mast to take the compression loads, stainless steel cables to take the tension loads. It's light on top and heavy on the bottom. But I'm not talking about the bridge. I'm talking about the boat. There isn't a sailboat in the bay that couldn't handle anything, any amount of shaking that the Hayward or San Andreas fault would subject it to. Now I know you're thinking, oh, no way. That's just because they're bobbing around in the water. No, wrong. If I dug a hole in the exact shape of that hull and keel, and I took a crane and I put this boat in the hole and then subjected it to the 1906 earthquake, it would be fine. And that's because it's built with triangles and curves. It's built with light, flexible material, fiberglass in its hull. It's heavy on the bottom, and it's got an aluminum mast and stainless steel cables on top where it's light. Now, the distinction even gets sharper if we go in the saloon of this boat. There's the galley on the left and below, and the dinette to the right. And you can see there's handholds everywhere. There's no sharp corners. Every cabinet is latched. There's no glassware that can fly anywhere. And the stove is gimbaled. I could make soup during the 1906 earthquake, no problem. So, no damage, no structural damage. Nobody would be injured if you went through strong shaking. Now, let's compare this to, okay, my favorite bar. Look at that. There's probably 100 bottles of liquor sitting on glass shelves in front of a glass mirror. What's going to happen to this bar a mile from the San Andreas in an earthquake? These are going to be missiles. These bartenders shouldn't be wearing tuxedos. They should be wearing hard hats. This is earthquake denial, the best evidence I have. Now let's compare that to virtually any bar in Japan. As an earthquake researcher, of course, I spent a lot of time in Japan. And look at this. All the liquor bottles restrained, all the glassware restrained. So this is really telling us everything we need to know, how unprepared we are for earthquakes. Now, all those wonderful things I was saying about the design of sailboats, you might say, well, first of all, why is that so? And I think the answer is that it's an accelerated Darwinian process. If a naval architect designs a sailboat that is not fit for purpose, in other words, it capsizes and goes to the bottom in the bay, next season, that architect is going to build a better boat. And it quickly changes. Materials get better, and design gets better. But with buildings, it's never in many architects' experience. There's a long time between earthquakes in any one area. And so these elements get ignored. Well, okay, it's fair to say that there is one kind of boat that doesn't meet these vaunted criteria, and that's a houseboat. So if you motored this boat into the San Francisco Bay on any summer afternoon with 25 or 30 knots of wind and 5 or 6 feet of chop, and you turned it broadside to the wind, it would probably capsize and go to the bottom. So if there were justice in the world, this would be its naval architect being pooped out the transom. But here's the bad news. We are all living in beached houseboats. And so we have to accept that our homes, for the most part, aren't really built to sustain this kind of shaking, inside or out, and we need to become aware of what our own seismic risk is. Because we don't have to live this way. Seismically strong buildings can be beautiful, can be graceful. We've made this decision, and we can make a different decision. So what at Temblor we've done is to create a mobile app, an iPhone and Android app, which you can download, and which allows you just to click on your risk, and it finds your location, it grabs information about your home from databases, and it calculates what the earthquake likely losses could be for you, and most important, how they'd be reduced by seismically retrofitting the home, or insuring at various levels of deductibles. So that's what you can do easily to understand your own risk. Let me show you a couple of examples. So here is my mom's condo. I let my mom buy a condo on the Santa Monica Fault. I'm an idiot. And how could I have done that? Well, she did it long before we built the app, and it was hard to put all this information together. And the idea of the app is it shouldn't be. It should be as easy as pulling it out and pushing a button. Now, let's go to Portland. So Portland, you just saw liquefaction susceptibility in Santa Monica. Now you're seeing in Oregon, and you could see how important it was for shaking and damage in San Francisco. So this is the reason, principally, why the number is high as it is here, because while Beaverton is close to faults, these faults aren't nearly as active as the faults in the Bay Area. Nevertheless, the repair costs could be very, very high, particularly if it's an old home like this one built before 1950. So I want to acknowledge the tremendous help I've had from the Temblor team and the people who helped build the demos that I have created, and also acknowledge the funding from the National Science Foundation for this presentation. And now let me make some closing remarks.
So I hope you've seen tonight that California's beauty, its wealth, its climate, and its history are inseparable from its seismic setting. The Bay Area's profound losses in 1906 were, ironically, science's gain. So to repay that debt, we need to transform the most hazardous regions in the world, including this one in Oregon, into the most resilient by mitigation and better seismic design and construction. Thank you.
So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Dr. Stein for taking time in his schedule to participate in the Geology lecture series as it goes virtual this year. Also, one of the things that I neglected at the beginning was to say that we do have the capacity to do a question and answer. So you do have a chat box. So while I make a couple closing remarks, if you have any questions for Dr. Stein, you'd be more than welcome to go ahead and type those in here, and we will will answer those questions shortly. I'd like to, again, several of them were on the screen at the beginning, but I'd like to thank our sponsors as well as Dallas for his tech support in getting this out into the airways. Our sponsors include DB Western, The Mill, Iris SSA that is bringing us Dr. Stein, usually in person, but this year virtually, as well as a couple of future speakers in the series as well. We also have the Ocean Discovery Lecture Series, which is providing us a couple of speakers, and also the Southwestern Foundation and the college as well. While we see if we have any questions, our next talk in the series will be on Saturday, November 7th, with a special 2 p.m. in the afternoon time for that talk with Dr. Ginny Edgecombe from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And Ginny is going to be discussing life in the lower crust. And this is a talk that was rescheduled from last spring. Some other topics that we've got coming up, seismic and whales for the annual Cascadia anniversary talk, climate change, radon, hydrothermal systems in life, and also a talk on Kilauea later in the year. So we don't have any questions so far. If you want to bring Ross back on, I do have a couple. So this is the first time that the equipment called the theodolite has shown up in a geology lecture series talk. And that one actually personally had me going with one of those aha moments because when I was growing up, I climbed the 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks. And one of the things that we always used to search for were the Colvin bolts, which were at or near the summits of all of the Adirondack high peaks, and a number of them still existed where they had the theodolites on and near the summit. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Can you tell us, while we wait and see if we have any other questions, what led you to start Temblor instead of potentially doing something similar with USGS or with Stanford or another university?
Well, Ron, the USGS does a wonderful job gathering data about the earthquake hazards of the world and providing it in a manner that can be used by engineers and professionals. But the public and most of us really need this translated into dollars and safety. Otherwise, it's not clear how we can use this information. So the survey runs the risk of frightening people rather than inspiring them to make the changes that we need to do to be safer. And of course, government agencies, if you go to a government agency and say, okay, you've convinced me I've got a problem, I want to retrofit my house. Could you recommend a retrofitter or an insurer? They can't answer that question because that's not something that a government agency can do. So our goal was to make this easy for people to do, to talk in the language that people think about for their safety of their own family, and to connect people with those who can actually solve the problem. I don't want people to worry. I want them to be inspired to make themselves safe.
And, one of the things, this is obviously an earthquake-related talk, and one of the things that I've been doing, I think this will be the 16th annual Cascadia anniversary talk. So either on the 26th of January or near that date, I've been hosting somebody talking about some aspect of earthquake, tsunami, seismic activity in some way, shape, or form. And on a level, that connection to people and preparedness has always been one of my goals with that. And I think this is a really good talk also to think of what we saw with San Francisco in 1906. And, a lot of us I know think of that preparedness and the preparedness kit and supplies on hand as almost being insurmountable. And so one of the things that I've been saying for several years now is every time you either hear about an earthquake, every time you go to one of these geology lecture series talks that has a seismic connection to it, pick a couple of objects. It doesn't have to be getting that full meal deal preparedness set up, but set aside a few more canned goods, set aside whatever it might be that fits your budget in the moment. I know currently that's potentially a little bit more difficult than even under a normal setting. But I appreciate that kind of straightforward, simple connection as to where to go with that. What's the
In answer to that,
something?
let me just make a comment about that. We're coming up in a few months, we'll be headed into Christmas and Hanukkah. And what we've done, my wife and I, is given our adult children and our nieces and our nephews earthquake kits as their Christmas or Hanukkah present. This is a way of showing our love, helping to prepare them. And, one of the things in the kit should be a solar collector and battery for our cell phones. We all know we're going to be dependent on our cell phones, but most of us need power very frequently that we're not going to get. So at Temblor, we also produce articles, several a week, 2 or 3 a week, and you could just search on earthquake emergency kit, and we have an article about the things we think are important to put in there, and that's certainly one of them.
Very good. What's the most surprising? Okay, here's one question. How different is the liquefaction risk on bay fill in comparison to old sand dunes? Asked by one of our audience members, Susan Hopkins.
Okay, great question. So what is liquefaction? Liquefaction is when loose sediments are infiltrated by water, and when shaken, what happens is that water comes to the surface, and the ground basically turns to quicksand, buildings sink or tilt, and then the whole thing turns into cement. And so buildings aren't designed for that. They aren't designed to tilt. And so even a good structurally sound building subject to liquefaction can be a total loss. And in 2011, in the town of Christchurch, New Zealand, a little earthquake of magnitude 6.3 destroyed the entire downtown business district and most of the residential district just from liquefaction. Okay, so the bay fill is probably the worst there is because it's a combination of rotting wood and sand that was basically trucked in from what is today Golden Gate Park. Now, what about sand dunes? Well, the western side of San Francisco are sand dunes. They've just built on sand dunes. It's not quite as bad because it's a natural phenomena and undergone natural compaction. The next up might be what's called engineered fill. We have communities, and you probably do too. Engineered fill just means that it's been pounded by tractors. But, as far as I'm concerned, the only real difference between engineered fill and fill is that engineered fill has been blessed by a rabbi. You don't want to live on any of them.
Well, and that's one of the Cascadia things too. A lot of folks wonder why I live here, but it's where we landed with employment. So, and I think that was a really good point early on that you made, that, we're blessed with a lot of things, and a lot of our neighborhood is amazing as far as the visuals that are associated with it, and their response to these occasional events, and we need to balance that. Is there one thing in your career that stands out as something that you found or discovered that was extremely unexpected?
Well, basically, everything is extremely unexpected in earthquake science. If you want to be smug, don't go into the field. It's utterly humbling. I mean, probably every other large earthquake that's occurred has occurred on a fault that we didn't know about. How about that? I mean, the Northridge earthquake, the Coalinga earthquake, recently, just last year, the Ridgecrest earthquake, a magnitude 7.1 in California, in the best mapped state in the world, on a fault we didn't know about. So we keep being surprised. We keep discovering how little we know. And really what that is a call for young scientists and for young people to jump into this field, because we do not have it figured out. We do not have it wired. We are going to depend on the next generation of scientists to figure out, to crack these big problems. Maybe there is a way to predict earthquakes. We haven't found it. Everything has failed us. But it doesn't mean that it's an intractable problem. You saw with QuakeCaster, it's a physical system in a force balance. We just don't seem to be able to make the right measurements. So it's humbling, but it's also exciting because you keep learning things that you never thought you'd see.
And I guess one of the things I usually point out to my students is every time you seem to get an answer for something in science, almost always it generates 2 or 3 more questions than the one that you just answered. So I appreciate the push to the next generation of seismologists out there, because potentially some of them are watching this today as well. And we definitely need new students coming up in that next generation to focus on the sciences. So I appreciate your time tonight. Looks like we don't have any more questions, so I will let you get back to your day. Again, I want to give my sincere thanks to Iris. We've had a really great partnership over the years, bringing some fantastic speakers into town. I really am saddened that I didn't get to show you the neighborhood, but I do greatly appreciate your willingness, Ross, to participate in this event electronically. Again, our next talk in the series will be on Saturday, November 7th. It'll be an afternoon talk, 2 p.m. to accommodate some time change issues or some time zone issues. 2 p.m. November 7th, a Saturday, with Dr. Ginny Edgecombe from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute talking about life in the lower crust. Thank you all. Stay, boy, tongue-tied tonight. Thank you all for participating. Stay safe, stay healthy, and as we navigate the new abnormal, hopefully I'll see you soon in our new building as well as in the Hale Center in the not too distant future. Thank you all. Good night.